The HOA president smiled while I stood beside my own well house without a drop of running water. Sometime before sunrise, her contractor had entered my property, cut through my padlock, replaced it with an HOA lock, and shut off the pump inside. A bright red notice hung from the latch. Community safety action, do not tamper. The well house stood more than 10 feet inside land my family had owned before the first subdivision road was ever paved. I paid for the electricity. I paid for every inspection, filter, repair, and water test. But according to the HOA president, none of that mattered anymore. She arrived just after 8 with 2 board members and warned me that removing their lock would result in fines, legal action, and possible arrest. Then she said something that made my blood boil. You may own the building, but this community controls what happens inside it. By breakfast, my faucets were dry. By noon, the HOA had emailed every homeowner claiming they had neutralized an unauthorized private water system that threatened community safety. And before 3 o'clock, the first fire district vehicle came speeding into the neighborhood. It was followed by a utility truck, 2 technicians, and the fire marshal himself. A routine hydrant test had failed. The pressure at the far end of the subdivision had collapsed, and the neighborhood's emergency storage tank was no longer refilling. The HOA president immediately blamed my illegal well. But the technicians did not walk toward the subdivision's pump station. They followed a buried supply line across the common area, through the drainage easement, and stopped at my fence. Then they pointed directly at my locked well house. The HOA president's smile disappeared. One technician opened an old fire suppression plan across the hood of his truck. The fire marshal compared the faded blue line on the page with the dead pressure gauge beside my pump. Then he looked at the red HOA lock. Who shut this system down? The HOA president lifted her violation notice and began explaining that the board had acted for community safety. He did not let her finish. He ordered everyone away from the building, called something in over his radio, and asked the technicians to verify a set of records the HOA had apparently never expected anyone to examine. A few minutes later, one of them returned with a folder. He whispered something to the fire marshal. The fire marshal looked at my well, then at the rows of houses stretching beyond the trees. Finally, he turned to the HOA president. What he said next drained the color from her face. Because the board had not simply broken into my property and locked me out of my own water supply. They had shut down something hidden beneath the neighborhood for years. And if the original records were correct, that red padlock was about to expose far more than an HOA violation. I had never thought of myself as the kind of person who would end up fighting an HOA. I was 46, worked as an industrial electrical technician, and spent most of my free time doing ordinary things around the property. I fixed fence posts, changed filters, kept the gravel driveway graded, and tried to stay out of neighborhood politics. I did not attend HOA meetings unless something directly affected me, and I had no interest in telling other people how to maintain their homes. The house itself was different from most of the homes around it. My uncle had owned the parcel before the subdivision existed. Back then, the land around us was mostly pasture, scrub oak, and open dirt roads. Years later, a developer bought the surrounding acreage and built what became Cedar Ridge Estates, a gated community of matching roofs, landscaped entrances, and more than 100 newer homes. My uncle refused to sell. Because of that, our parcel remained like an island inside the development. The HOA surrounded us geographically, but legally, my property had a much older deed and was subject to only a limited set of recorded restrictions. Most of the newer HOA rules had never been attached to my land. When my uncle passed away, I purchased the property from the estate. I kept it because it was one of the few places that still felt connected to my family. My father had spent weekends there when I was young. He had helped my uncle repair the barn roof, rebuild sections of the fence, and replace the old well pump when I was still a teenager. He was the one who taught me how to shut off the breaker before opening a pump control box and how to listen for the difference between a healthy motor and one starting to fail. There was still an old adjustable wrench hanging inside the well house. It had belonged to him. The handle was worn smooth, and one side had a shallow burn mark from a mistake he had made while working near an electrical panel decades earlier. It was probably worth $10 at a hardware store, but I would not have traded it for anything. That little well house was never just some utility shed to me. The well supplied my home, a few outdoor faucets, and the irrigation line I used for the garden. I paid the electric bill. I paid for annual water testing. When the pressure tank failed 3 years earlier, I paid nearly $2,000 to replace it. When the pump needed servicing, the technician called me, not the HOA. For most of the 11 years I lived there, nobody questioned any of that. The first HOA board mostly left me alone. Occasionally, I received a newsletter or an invitation to a community event, but there was a quiet understanding that my parcel was different. That changed when Linda Carver became board president. Linda treated the neighborhood like a company she had been hired to reorganize. Rules that had once been suggestions suddenly came with deadlines. Small landscaping issues became formal violations. Residents began receiving notices about trash cans visible from the street, basketball hoops, faded mailbox, paint, and vehicles parked in driveways overnight. Then the notices started reaching me. First, it was the color of my barn. Then the gravel along the edge of my driveway. Then a warning that one section of my back fence did not match the approved community style. Each time, I responded the same way. I asked the board to show me the recorded covenant that gave them authority over that part of my property. Most of the time, the issue disappeared. I assumed that meant they understood the boundary. I was wrong. About 6 weeks before the lock appeared on my well house, the property manager emailed me a document called a Community Water Maintenance Agreement. It would have given the HOA broad access to the well, the pump controls, and the surrounding area whenever the board determined that community operations required it. I read it twice. The language was far broader than anything I remembered seeing in my deed. So I did not sign it. I simply asked them to identify the existing legal right they believed allowed that level of access. No one answered that question. Instead, the pressure started. Looking back, that silence mattered more than any violation notice they sent afterward. The HOA was not trying to clarify a right it already had. It was trying to get me to sign one into existence. And if you have ever owned a piece of property that carries more meaning than its market value, you probably understand why I was not willing to sign away control just because a board member told me it was routine. Share your thoughts in the comments, because I learned very quickly that the most dangerous paperwork is often the paperwork everyone tells you not to worry about. At the time, though, I still believed this could be handled with a few emails and a copy of my deed. I had no idea the board had already started planning what it would do if I kept saying no. The first official violation notice arrived 9 days after I refused to sign the new water agreement. It claimed that my well house had an unapproved exterior access system and that the existing lock did not comply with community safety standards. That wording caught my attention immediately. The HOA had never inspected my lock before. Nobody had ever mentioned it in 11 years. More importantly, there was nothing in the restrictions attached to my parcel that required HOA approval for hardware on a private utility structure. I emailed the property manager and asked for the exact covenant they were relying on. Instead of answering, she sent me a second notice. This one added a daily fine. I replied again, more carefully this time. I stated that the well house was privately owned, entirely within my parcel, and maintained at my expense. I asked the board to provide any recorded document giving them authority to control access to it. Linda Carver answered personally. Her email said the well served a community function, which meant the board had the right to ensure it remained secure and accessible for emergency purposes. I read that sentence several times. If they believed they already had a legal right to access the well, then there should have been a recorded easement, agreement, or covenant proving it. So I asked for that document. Again, no one sent one. 3 mornings later, I left for work just before 7. My rear security camera recorded what happened after I was gone. At 9:18, a white contractor van pulled into the service lane near my property. 2 men got out wearing work shirts with the logo of a local maintenance company. A few minutes later, the HOA property manager arrived in her SUV. The camera did not record audio clearly enough to capture every word, but it showed everything else. The property manager pointed toward my well house. One contractor examined the lock. The other retrieved bolt cutters from the van. They cut my padlock off. Then, they opened the door to my well house and went inside. The footage showed them moving around the pump controls for almost 15 minutes before one of them came back outside carrying my lock in his hand. He tossed it into a plastic bucket. Then they installed a heavy commercial padlock of their own. Before leaving, they mounted a lockout box over the electrical disconnect. When I got home that evening, the first thing I noticed was the red tag on the door. The second thing I noticed was silence. Normally, when I opened an outdoor faucet near the garden, I could hear the pump cycle in the distance. That evening, Nothing happened. I checked the pressure gauge. The reading was falling. I walked to the well house and found their new lock. I did not touch it. Instead, I took photographs from every angle. I photographed the latch, the new padlock, the red HOA tag, the lockout device on the electrical disconnect, the ground around the building, and the tire tracks leading away from the service lane. Then I went inside and pulled up the camera footage. I watched it twice. By the end of the second viewing, I was no longer wondering whether the HOA had crossed the line. I knew they had. Still, I did not cut their lock. That was exactly the kind of reaction they seemed to be waiting for. If I broke it, they could claim I had interfered with equipment they were calling emergency infrastructure. They might even try to turn the dispute into a safety issue. So, instead, I called the property manager. She told me the board had secured the system because I had refused to cooperate with a reasonable safety request. I asked her whether the HOA had authorized a contractor to enter my land and remove my lock. She avoided the question. I asked whether they had shut off the pump. She told me to put my concerns in writing. So I did. I sent one email. It was short. I asked the board to confirm whether it had authorized the contractor to disable electrical power to the well pump. I did not accuse them of anything. I did not threaten legal action. I just wanted the answer, in writing. 23 minutes later, Linda replied. She confirmed that the board had authorized the shutdown. That email became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire dispute. Within hours, the consequences became real. My house still had limited water from the pressure tank, but it was not going to last. I switched to a backup connection I had rarely used and stopped irrigation entirely. The HOA, meanwhile, sent residents a community notice claiming that routine maintenance had been performed on shared water infrastructure. That phrase bothered me even more than the lock. My well was not shared infrastructure. At least, not according to any document I had ever seen. 2 days later, a fire district crew arrived in the neighborhood for what residents were told was a routine hydrant flow test. The hydrant near the front entrance performed normally. The one near the far end of the subdivision did not. Pressure dropped sharply during the test. The crew checked another hydrant. Then, another. By that afternoon, technicians were examining the emergency storage tank near the common area. I could see them from the back of my property. One man kept looking at a set of plans. Another was tracing a buried line through the grass with marking paint. The line moved away from the tank, past the drainage corridor, across the edge of the common area, then directly toward my property. I stood behind my fence watching as the technicians followed it. They stopped near my well house. That was the first moment I realized the HOA's decision might have created a problem much larger than my household water supply. The next morning, I received another violation notice. The board had doubled the daily fine for continued noncompliance. They were still treating me like the problem, but the fire district had started asking questions of its own, and those questions were heading straight toward the same locked door. Once I realized the fire district was tracing its own water system toward my well, I stopped treating the situation like a disagreement with an overreaching HOA board. I started treating it like a case. The first thing I did was build a timeline. I downloaded every security camera clip from the day the contractor entered my property. I saved the original files, made duplicate copies, and wrote down the exact timestamps. I photographed the new padlock again, the electrical lockout box, the red HOA notice, and the pressure gauge inside the exterior access panel. Then, I printed every email, the violation notices, the maintenance agreement they wanted me to sign, my requests for the legal authority they claimed to have, Linda's message saying the well served a community function, and, most importantly, the email where she confirmed that the board had authorized the shutdown. I also pulled 11 years of records from my own files. Pump service invoices, water testing reports, electrical bills, receipts for pressure tank replacement, a repair invoice from a well contractor who had serviced the system 3 years earlier. Every document had my name on it. None of them had the HOA's. That did not prove everything, but it proved something important. For more than a decade, everyone had behaved as if the well belonged to me. Next, I called a licensed surveyor. I did not tell him what result I wanted. I gave him my parcel number, a copy of the deed, and the old survey I had inherited with the property records. I asked him to locate the boundary and tell me exactly where the well house sat. 2 days later, he placed fresh stakes along the property line. The result was not close. The well casing, pump controls, electrical feed, and the entire well house were all more than 10 feet inside my parcel. The contractor had not stepped a few inches over an uncertain boundary. They had walked onto clearly private land and taken control of a structure sitting well inside it. The surveyor prepared a signed site drawing. That document changed the way I looked at the dispute. The HOA could argue about rules. They could argue about community standards. They could even argue that the well somehow benefited the neighborhood. But the survey removed one thing from the argument entirely. They could not honestly claim they thought the building sat on common property. My next stop was the county recorder's office. I spent most of a morning going through recorded documents tied to my parcel and the original subdivision. That was where I found the first piece of the puzzle. Buried in the older records was a document from 18 years earlier, signed during the development phase. It was titled as a water use agreement. At first, I thought the HOA might finally have the document it had been talking about. Then I read it carefully. The agreement did not transfer ownership of the well. It did not give the developer control of the well house. It did not give anyone unrestricted access. Instead, it granted a limited right to draw water for an emergency storage system connected to the subdivision's fire protection infrastructure. The language was surprisingly specific. The well remained part of the private parcel. Access for inspection or maintenance required notice and coordination with the property owner, except in a genuine emergency. And the party benefiting from the emergency water connection was responsible for costs related to the portion of the system serving that function. I read those provisions more than once. The HOA had spent weeks telling me that the well was effectively community infrastructure. The recorded agreement said something very different. It said they might have a limited right to use water under certain conditions. That was not the same thing as owning the equipment. It was not the same thing as controlling the pump. And it definitely was not the same thing as cutting my lock and shutting the system down because I refused to sign a new agreement. That raised another question. Why did they need me to sign a new agreement at all if their existing rights were supposedly as broad as Linda claimed? I made copies of everything. Then I went to the county permitting office. The subdivision's original fire system records were older, but they were still available. The plans showed an emergency storage tank connected to the hydrant loop. One sheet referenced a supplemental refill source from the private well parcel. My parcel. The notation was technical, but clear enough for me to understand the basic design. The tank was not simply a decorative reserve sitting independently in the neighborhood. The system expected a way to refill it, and the old plan showed my well as part of that equation. That was when I called an attorney. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, and she handled property disputes, easements, and land use conflicts. I brought her a folder so thick that I was almost embarrassed by it. She was not. She went through the deed, the survey, the recorded agreement, the HOA notices, and the camera screenshots. Then she stopped at Linda's email confirming the shutdown. She read it twice. Sarah told me not to contact the board by phone anymore. Everything would be in writing. She sent a preservation letter to the HOA and its management company demanding that they keep all board minutes, emails, contractor work orders, internal messages, invoices, and insurance communications related to my well. Then, she requested the fire district records connected to the hydrant tests. A few days later, those records started coming in. One inspection note said the emergency tank had to maintain a minimum operational level. Another referenced the need for the refill source to remain functional. Then Sarah found something even more important in the HOA records we had requested. A maintenance contractor had warned the property manager nearly a year earlier that the subdivision's emergency water arrangement depended on continued access to the supplemental source unless the HOA installed a separate refill system. The warning had been written down. The board had been told, and they had done nothing. That was no longer a simple question of whether Linda misunderstood an easement. Someone had warned them that the fire water system depended on continued operation of that source. Yet months later, they ordered the pump shut down themselves. The deeper I dug, the less this looked like an accident. And the next document Sarah uncovered explained exactly why the board had been so desperate to get my signature on that new agreement. The document Sarah found next was not dramatic by itself. It was a budget memo, but it explained almost everything. About 10 months before the HOA locked my well house, A fire system contractor had inspected the subdivision's emergency water setup and recommended that the association install a dedicated refill connection that did not depend on my private well. The estimate was expensive, not catastrophic for a neighborhood our size, but large enough that the board would probably have needed a special assessment or a major increase in dues. The memo showed that the board had discussed three options. The first was to install the independent refill system. The second was to negotiate a new long-term agreement with me. The third was to continue operating under the existing limited water use arrangement and hope no major repair or access dispute came up. The board rejected the first option because of cost. Then they tried the second. That was the agreement they had sent me, the one giving them broad operational access to my well house. Suddenly, the timing made sense. They had not discovered some new safety concern with my lock. They had discovered that the existing agreement did not give them enough control. And when I refused to sign away more rights, they tried to create that control through HOA enforcement. Sarah laid the documents across her conference table in chronological order. First came the contractor warning that the community should secure an independent water source or obtain a stronger agreement with the private well owner. Then came the internal discussion about cost. Then came the proposed agreement they sent me. Then my refusal. Then the first violation notice. Then the daily fines. Then the contractor entering my land. Then Linda's written confirmation that the board had ordered the pump shut down. It was the sequence that mattered. A single email could be explained away. A single bad decision could be called a misunderstanding. But a sequence showed intent. Sarah told me that the strongest part of our position was not simply that the HOA had entered private property. It was that they appeared to have used their enforcement authority to pressure me into giving them a private contractual right they did not already possess. The recorded water use agreement was very narrow. The HOA had a limited benefit. It did not have ownership. It did not have unrestricted operational control. It did not have the right to replace my lock because a board member disliked my answer. And nothing in the agreement said they could intentionally disable the system that provided the very water they claimed was necessary for community safety. That contradiction became the center of Sarah's response. The HOA's attorney had finally become involved and sent a letter arguing that the board had acted to protect emergency infrastructure. Sarah answered with one question. If the well was so critical to emergency safety that the HOA believed extraordinary access was justified, why had the board authorized shutting it off? The answer did not come quickly. When it finally arrived, it was vague. The HOA claimed the shutdown had been temporary and necessary to secure operational control. That phrase hurt them even more. Operational control was exactly what the recorded agreement did not give them. Sarah sent a formal demand letter. It required the HOA to remove its lock, restore the electrical system, suspend all fines, reimburse the costs I had incurred, and confirm in writing that no employee, board member, or contractor would enter the parcel without lawful authority. She also demanded reimbursement for survey expenses and attorney fees connected to the incident. But the letter did not stop there. Sarah attached the survey, the recorded agreement, the contractor warning, the HOA's own maintenance proposal, Linda's shutdown email, and screenshots from my security camera. Then, she copied the HOA's insurance carrier. That changed the temperature almost immediately. Until then, Linda had been acting as if the board could simply outlast me. Once the insurance company became aware of the claim, the board was no longer controlling the entire conversation. The carrier wanted documents. They wanted meeting minutes. They wanted to know whether the board had received legal advice before entering private property. They wanted to know why a contractor had been told the HOA controlled a structure that the survey showed was privately owned. And they wanted to know whether the board knew the shutdown could affect the subdivision's firewater system. Sarah also learned that the maintenance company had already started protecting itself. The contractor who cut my lock produced the work order it had received from the property manager. That work order described the well house as HOA-controlled emergency infrastructure. The contractor had relied on that representation. Now the company was asking the property manager to explain where that information came from. For the first time, the people who had been standing together against me started pointing at one another. Linda blamed the management company. The management company blamed the board's instructions. The contractor blamed the work order. And the HOA attorney carefully stopped making broad claims about ownership. The fire district records made the problem worse. One older inspection note stated that the emergency storage system relied on a functional refill source. Another showed that an alternative dedicated connection had been recommended but never installed. Sarah told me something I had not considered. If the board knowingly delayed a fire safety upgrade because of cost, then interfered with the existing source while trying to force me into a broader agreement, the dispute could become much more than a property access claim. It could become an insurance issue, a governance issue, and potentially a fire code issue. I still did not want revenge. I wanted my well back. I wanted the fines canceled. And I wanted the board to understand that an HOA title did not erase property rights. But by then, the consequences were no longer mine to control. The fire district scheduled a full inspection of the hydrant loop and emergency tank. The county was notified that electrical equipment on a private parcel had been altered during the dispute, and the HOA's insurer requested the same board records Sarah had already demanded. What had started as a padlock on a small building behind my house was turning into 3 separate official files. Then the fire marshal called Sarah. He wanted the original water use agreement, the current survey, and the contractor shutdown records before the inspection. That was when I knew the next meeting at my well house was not going to feel anything like an HOA hearing. The inspection started at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. By 8:40, the HOA had already lost control of the situation. The fire marshal arrived first with a district inspector and 2 technicians from the fire system contractor. A county code enforcement vehicle pulled in a few minutes later. Sarah was there beside me with a folder containing the survey, the recorded water use agreement, and copies of every notice the HOA had sent. Linda arrived with the property manager and the same maintenance contractor whose employees had cut my lock. Nobody looked comfortable. The fire marshal did not begin with opinions. He began with documents. He asked for the original subdivision fire protection plans, the most recent hydrant inspection records, the emergency tank maintenance history, and the written authorization for shutting down the well pump. The property manager handed him a binder. Sarah handed him our records. Then we walked to the well house. The new padlock was still hanging from the latch. The HOA's red safety tag was faded from several days in the sun, but the wording was still visible. The fire marshal read it, looked at Linda, then looked at the survey stakes running across the property. He asked where the common area boundary was. The county inspector pointed to the marked line. The well house sat well inside my parcel. That was the first moment the tone changed. The fire marshal asked Linda who owned the structure. She said the HOA considered it part of the community's emergency water infrastructure. Sarah immediately handed him the recorded agreement. He read the relevant pages slowly. Then, he asked the question that mattered. Not whether the HOA benefited from the well. Not whether the water line connected to community equipment. He asked who owned the well. The agreement identified the private parcel owner. Me. He asked whether the document gave the HOA exclusive operational control. It did not. He asked whether the HOA had permission to replace my lock. No one produced any. Then he asked why the pump had been shut down. Linda said the board needed to secure the system because there had been uncertainty over access. The fire marshal looked at the dead pressure gauge. Then he looked toward the emergency tank. The technician beside him said the words Linda had been trying to avoid. The well was part of the tank's supplemental refill path. The fire marshal asked this simple follow-up. If the purpose was to protect emergency infrastructure, why had the HOA disabled the equipment that supplied it? Nobody answered. The technicians restored temporary access to the system under the fire marshal's supervision. They checked the pump controls, verified the line, and tested the refill rate. Then the hydrant testing began. The first hydrant opened with a hard rush of water. The pressure numbers were acceptable at first. As the test continued, the technicians watched the system recovery. The emergency tank was not designed to be limitless. It depended on a functioning refill source to restore capacity after demand. With the well pump disabled, that recovery had been compromised. The system had not instantly become useless, but it had lost part of the design redundancy the original plans relied on. That distinction mattered. The fire marshal was careful with his language. He did not accuse anyone of endangering the neighborhood on purpose. He documented that the refill source shown in the historical system design had been intentionally disabled and that the HOA needed to demonstrate an approved, reliable replacement or restore compliant operation. He issued a corrective action notice. That was the point where the dispute stopped being something Linda could dismiss in an email. There was now an official file. The HOA had deadlines. The fire district wanted updated system documentation. The county wanted clarification on who had authorized work on the electrical equipment inside my property. And the insurance carrier wanted the same information. Then the contractor made things worse for the HOA. One of the company representatives handed the county inspector a copy of the work order. The description said the well house was owned and controlled by the HOA. The inspector compared that claim with the survey, then with the deed, then with the water use agreement. The contractor representative made it clear that his employees had relied on instructions from the property manager. The property manager immediately said she had acted on board direction. Linda said the board had relied on management's interpretation of the agreement. Within 10 minutes, the people who had confidently entered my property together were explaining why someone else had been responsible. I said almost nothing. I did not need to. The records were speaking for me. By that afternoon, the county inspector had requested additional documentation about the electrical lockout work. The fire marshal required the HOA to submit a plan showing how it would maintain a dependable emergency water supply going forward. And Sarah received an email from the HOA's insurance carrier asking for copies of our survey, the camera footage, and the demand letter. The insurer also asked whether the board had been warned before the shutdown that the subdivision depended on the well. We had that warning. A week later, the issue reached the HOA's public meeting. The room was fuller than I had ever seen it. Most residents had only heard fragments of what happened. They knew there had been a hydrant inspection. They knew the fire district had issued a notice. They did not know the board had cut the lock off a privately owned well house. They did not know the board had ordered the pump shut down. And they definitely did not know a contractor had recommended an independent refill system nearly a year earlier. Sarah did not give a speech. She placed the documents in order. The survey, the agreement, the contractor warning, the proposed new access agreement, my refusal, the violation notices, the shutdown email, the fire district notice. The room changed as people understood the sequence. One homeowner asked why the board had spent money enforcing a dispute against me instead of funding the fire system upgrade. Another asked whether the HOA's insurance would cover a loss if the board had ignored a documented warning. A third asked why residents had been told the shutdown was routine maintenance. Linda tried to bring the conversation back to safety. She said the board had been trying to protect the community. That argument had worked before. It did not work now, because everyone in the room could see the problem. The board had used safety as the reason to take control of my well. Then it had shut down the equipment its own safety system relied on. The HOA attorney, who was sitting beside Linda, did not defend the ownership claim. He recommended that the board enter executive session. That was probably the most important thing he said all night. By the end of the week, the daily fines against me were suspended. The HOA removed its lock under written agreement. My access was restored. And the board began negotiating with the fire district over the independent refill system it had avoided paying for months earlier. For the first time since this started, the HOA was no longer telling me what it believed I had to do. It was explaining to regulators what it had already done. And those explanations were getting more expensive by the day. The settlement came 3 weeks after the public meeting. By then, the HOA had very little room left to pretend this was a simple compliance dispute. The fire district had an open corrective action file. The county had documented the unauthorized work on my property. The HOA's insurance carrier had reviewed the contractor warning, the board records, and Linda's shutdown email. And Sarah had made it clear that if the association wanted to fight over ownership, access, fines, and damages, we were prepared to let a judge read the same documents everyone else had already seen. The board chose settlement instead. The first thing they did was cancel every fine connected to the well house. Not reduce them, not suspend them, cancel them. They also reimbursed my survey costs, paid for the damaged lock and electrical restoration, and covered a substantial portion of the attorney fees I had spent defending rights that had already been written into my deed. More important than the money was the written acknowledgement. The HOA signed an agreement confirming that the well house, pump controls, and surrounding land were under my private ownership and control. The old water use agreement remained in effect exactly as recorded. They could receive the limited emergency benefit it granted. They could not turn that limited benefit into ownership. They could not install another lock. They could not send contractors onto the parcel whenever they wanted. and they could not use HOA fines as leverage to force me into signing broader access rights. The fire district required a separate solution. The HOA was ordered to present a compliant plan for maintaining dependable emergency water capacity without relying on informal assumptions about my private equipment. That meant returning to the project the board had tried to avoid. The independent refill system, the same upgrade they had decided was too expensive before this entire mess began. Only now it cost more. There were new engineering fees, inspections, emergency review costs, and contractor expenses. Residents were not happy about that. But this time, they knew why the bill had grown. The management company opened its own internal review after the contractor produced the work order falsely describing my well house as HOA-controlled property. The property manager who authorized the job was removed from our community account. The maintenance contractor did not renew its HOA service agreement after the dispute was resolved. And when the next board election arrived, Linda lost her seat as president. I did not campaign against her. I did not have to. People remembered the meeting. They remembered the documents. They remembered that residents had been told the shutdown was routine maintenance, while the fire district was investigating why part of the refill system was no longer functioning. A new board took over several months later. One of its first decisions was surprisingly simple. Before sending a violation involving property boundaries, easements, or older parcels, the management company had to verify the recorded documents first. That policy probably should have existed all along. The day the settlement became final, I walked out to the well house alone. The HOA lock was gone. The damaged latch had been replaced. The pump was running normally again. I opened the door and stood there for a while listening to the motorcycle. Then I noticed my father's old adjustable wrench still hanging on the wall exactly where I had left it. For weeks, that small building had been described as shared infrastructure, community equipment, emergency property, and half a dozen other things designed to make my ownership sound less important. But the records had never been confused. The deed was clear. The survey was clear. The agreement was clear. The confusion had only existed because people with authority assumed their confidence could replace paperwork. I put a new padlock on the door. This one was mine. I slipped the key into my pocket and walked back toward the house. I never won because I shouted louder than the HOA. I never threatened anyone. I never cut their lock in anger. I kept the camera footage. I saved the emails. I ordered the survey. I read the agreement. And I let the people with actual legal and regulatory authority compare the facts with the story the board had been telling. That was enough. Sometimes protecting your property is not about being aggressive. It is about knowing exactly where your rights begin, where someone else's authority ends, and having the patience to prove the difference. And if you think an HOA should never be allowed to turn community safety into an excuse for taking control of private property, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who has ever dealt with an HOA, save the video in case you ever need the reminder to document everything, and subscribe for more stories where records, evidence, and property rights finally speak louder than intimidation.